A fascinação do público mundial com o período nazista, Hitler e a Segunda Guerra Mundial não dá sinais de parar, apesar do tempo decorrido. O cinema produziu uma categoria específica de obras sobre o período, parte factual, outras de ficção, mas sempre inspiradas naquela época que ainda intriga o público. Para citar só 2 filmes recentes, Tom Cruise apareceu em Operação Valquíria, como oficial nazista que, na história real, tentou matar Hitler em 1944. O Oscar de 2009 para melhor filme estrangeiro foi para a produção alemã A Fita Branca, que pinta um quadro da sociedade germânica no início do século XX, quando já despontavam as sementes de repressão e violência que iriam explodir em 2 guerras mundiais.
Ich werde euch also morgen Abend die gleiche Zeit vor euren Geschwistern jeweils 10 Rutenschläge zuzählen.
Das war ein Befehl! Der Angriff Steiners war ein Befehl!
Poucos anos atrás, o ator suíço Bruno Ganz chocou plateias no papel do ditador em A Queda, As Últimas Horas de Hitler.
Ich hätte gut daran getan, von Jahren alle höheren Offiziere liquidieren zu lassen, wie Stalin!
E uma exposição recente em Berlim sobre o Führer provocou debates acalorados na Alemanha sobre o perigo de recriar idolatria em torno de Hitler. A literatura sobre o período também é vasta, como é numerosa a produção de história em cima da origem, ascensão e queda do Terceiro Reich. Entre as obras mais respeitadas e elogiadas sobre o período nazista estão os 3 volumes escritos pelo britânico Richard Evans, professor de História da Universidade de Cambridge, na Inglaterra. O trabalho dele foi traduzido em vários idiomas e um volume já foi lançado no Brasil. Outros historiadores elogiaram o vasto trabalho de pesquisa e análise de Evans. O Milênio foi ao encontro de Richard Evans na Universidade de Cambridge, onde ele chefia o Departamento de História.
Okay, you wrote a trilogy about the Third Reich and about that period. It's been, in fact, 80 years since Hitler came to power, 65 years after the war was over. And still there's a fascination about that period, as your books indicate. Why do you think there is such fascination?
Well, I think, first of all, it's such a dramatic story of the fall of a promising, hopeful democracy in the Weimar Republic. And 1932-33, it falls and replaced by a dictatorship. So we are all interested in how democracies fall and fail, and it's one of the most dramatic stories. But then much more important than that, I think, is what happens afterwards. And the crimes of the Nazi regime were simply so enormous and so horrendous. They're unparalleled in human history. Some other dictators and tyrants come close, but ultimately I think the warmongering, the genocide, the everything that the Nazis did, I think goes way beyond anything else, and that I think poses a lot of questions to human understanding, of moral understanding, of historical, philosophical understanding. It poses a lot of questions that I think continue to preoccupy us to the present day.
But all these films, books, documentaries, and TV dramas, do you think there's a danger of glamorizing the period?
Absolutely, sure, of course. You know, because there's so much interest in the Nazi period, that means that people sometimes will want to cash in on it and trivialize it. And there are too many programs about Hitler's sex life or similar things like that that really take very trivial aspects of the question. And or sensational programs. Did Hitler have a child with the English admirer Unity Mitford? There was a whole TV program about that not so long ago in England. And of course it came to the conclusion at the end that it was very unlikely, but it kind of titillated the viewers with the story and told us nothing of any interest or importance about Nazi Germany. Right. So yeah, sure, there's a danger of that. But on the other hand, there are some very good, serious and solid films. Even Hollywood can do good films. I thought Valkyrie, the film with Tom Cruise about the German resistance, was a good film. It was well made and stuck closely to the historical record. And of course the German movie Downfall, about the last days of Hitler, again I think was there's some things I could criticize it for, but in general I think it was an excellent portrayal.
It is often said about history that it's made by socioeconomic and political factors and not by personalities. But in the case of Germany and the Nazi period and that war, could it all have taken place without somebody like Hitler?
Well, what's fascinating about history, of course, is the mixture of the broader factors, the big trends, and then the individual personalities, and then the elements of chance. And for the historian, it's endlessly fascinating to try and work out how they all fit together in different circumstances. I think clearly in the case of Nazi Germany and the Weimar Republic that preceded it, it was very unlikely that someone like Hitler would have come to power for most of the Weimar Republic. We have to remember in 1928, 5 years before he took power, his Nazi party gained less than 3% of the vote in the national elections. What really changed the situation was the Depression, the Wall Street crash followed by the withdrawal of American loans from Germany, the collapse of businesses, bankruptcies, 35% unemployed, absolute misery and seemingly no end. And that brought to people's mind in Germany then the previous disasters of the Weimar Republic, the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty, the massive hyperinflation, and all of these things went together to give the Nazis a chance to have an electoral appeal, to become a mass party. So within just a few months they were a major political party from the fringes. By the middle of 1932 they were the largest political party. Still only got 34% of the vote, just over a third of the vote. So I'll start that again. They still only got just over a third of the vote in the national elections, but they were the largest party.
But then Hitler comes to power in 1933, and of course at that time, for all the reasons you mentioned, there was a demand in Germany from some form of strong government, authoritarian government. But could it have been an authoritarian government of a different kind, not with Hitler, not with the Nazis?
Well, the alternative in Germany in 1932 to 33 was really between an authoritarian government run by conservatives and the army, or a dictatorship established by Hitler. I think by that stage, really, the chances of democracy surviving were really very small.
And when he did come to power in 1933, legally, as we just mentioned, he didn't take power in a revolution. He came to power legally. In 6 months, he transformed Germany into a dictatorship. How did he do that so fast?
Well, Hitler didn't really come to power legally. He was installed in power as the head of the largest party by a small group of conservatives around the aged President von Hindenburg and his friend von Papen, who thought they could use Hitler to give them the mass support. Yeah, manipulate him to give them mass support that they needed. They had almost no votes themselves, but they wanted to turn Germany into an authoritarian state to suppress communism, smash the Marxist Social Democrats and so on. But once Hitler became Chancellor, he converted that position with only 3 Nazis as a minority in a cabinet dominated by conservatives into a one-party state within 6 months. And he did that by 2 means. But first of all, as is generally known, and you find this in all the history books, by having the president issue a decree suspending civil liberties after the Reichstag the Parliament building was burnt down, and then in February, and then getting the Reichstag, the Parliament, to pass an enabling act in March, which gave him, Hitler and his cabinet, the power to make laws on their own without reference to Parliament.
He had taken power in January.
Well, he hadn't really taken power, you see. He needed to convert the office of Reich Chancellor, head of the government, into power. In 1932, almost nobody had. There was a kind of power vacuum in Germany. There were different groups that were trying to fill it. The Reichstag didn't meet. It was ruled by decree. Everyone disagreed so deeply about what to do with the Depression and to solve the situation. And Hitler then filled that between January 1933 and July 1933. And it's often forgotten that a prime way in which he did this was through the use of mass violence and intimidation. Almost straight away, concentration camps were set up. Over 100,000 of the Nazis' opponents were thrown into them, beaten up, badly treated, released on promise of good behavior. There were, even according to the official figures, over 600 murders in those months. The stormtroopers tortured people working for the Nazis. They arrested social democrats and communists. And again, the social democrats and the communists had gained actually also about a third, just over a third of the vote in the elections. So they were combined, they were actually slightly stronger than the Nazis in electoral terms. Because they spent the time fighting each other, of course, there was the problem.
As it typically happens. You mentioned all that violence, all that repression. There was a lot of popular support for that. You could understand the identification of the people with the ideology of the Nazis, perhaps with the political methods in other areas, but the violence, the fact that people were denouncing each other, the spies, that strong internal repression, the people went along with that.
Well, not the people, you see. It's always important to distinguish. So, by and large, the middle classes didn't buy everything that the Nazis said, but they went along with the suppression of the labor movement, and particularly the Communist Party, which was very strong in Germany. They got 17% of the vote in the last elections of 1932, and they wanted a Soviet Germany. They wanted to set up a Soviet-style dictatorship, and the middle classes in Germany and people in the countryside, particularly in Protestant North Germany, were extremely afraid of communism, which Hitler, of course, managed cleverly to exploit.
His basic ideas we're all familiar with, the radical anti-Semitism, the belief of history as a racial struggle, a fight against Marxism, the inevitability of war, the German superiority and the need for space of the German people. These ideas, did he develop them throughout the end of his life, or were they all there in the Mein Kampf already, early in his political life?
Well, anti-Semitism is already there in his first political utterance in 1919, even before Mein Kampf, his book, My Struggle, which is sort of autobiography and political tract, which he wrote in prison in 1924-5. The idea that the Jews somehow all over the world were engaged in an enormous conspiracy to destroy Germany, that was there from the beginning, because it was his explanation to himself, paranoid explanation of how Germany had lost the First World War, the famous stab in the back through which he thought Jewish revolutionaries and conspirators had destroyed the German army by revolution. In fact, of course, it's absolute nonsense. The German army was beaten on the battlefield, and then came the revolution, and the revolution was not Jewish-led. The Jews in Germany were a tiny, tiny minority, less than 1% of the population. So that was there. And the second thing that was there that then comes in the course of the 1920s, and you can find that in Mein Kampf, one of its earlier expressions, is the idea of Lebensraum, of living space, by which he meant conquering Eastern Europe, conquering Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, a large part of Western Russia, in order to get food supplies, raw materials, oil, all kinds of materials that Germany herself lacked. And again, that grew out of his experience as a soldier in the First World War, where Germany had been blockaded by the Allies, and over 500,000 Germans had died of malnutrition and associated diseases.
A very common narrative, as you know, here in the UK and in the US, is that the Americans, the British, are the ones who really defeated Hitler.
Yes.
With a minor contribution, perhaps, from the Soviets. What is your view of that, the role of all this?
Well, I think that's wrong. That's a perception that's changing now. I mean, Hitler feared the Soviets partly because he thought that they would completely destroy Germany. They were Bolsheviks led by Jews who were hell-bent on the destruction of Germany. In fact, Stalin himself was anti-Semitic, and there was a very great misperception. But the Americans, the British, he felt more ambivalent towards, particularly towards the British, and he hoped initially the British would stay neutral. But it's important to remember there's never any time from the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 until the end of the war when there's less than 2/3 of the German armed forces are engaged on the Eastern Front. It's the major theatre of war for the Germans.
So when Normandy came, there was a minor theatre as far as Hitler was concerned.
Yes, absolutely. It was that was not the main place where the war was happening, and the number of troops killed, the number of deaths on the Eastern Front during the war were greater than those of all the other theatres of war in Europe and Asia and everywhere combined. It was an unimaginable scale. Sick.
Let's consider the Holocaust, you know, the well-planned killing of millions of Jews by the Nazi machinery. To this day, some people, and you know this very well because you're involved in a trial on that subject, some people say that Hitler himself was not aware of that the people around him were carrying out the Holocaust, that he wasn't told. There's no document that he signed approving it, and although he was anti-Semitic, you cannot link him directly to that. What do you think of that?
There is a mass of evidence now. Some of it's emerged fairly recently. There are a lot of records in the diaries of Joseph Goebbels, for example, his Minister of Propaganda, who kept voluminous diaries, which were only released in the 1990s in full, records of conversations with Hitler, talking about the extermination of the Jews. If you look at some of Hitler's last utterances, even his political testament, he talks quite clearly about the way the Jews have had to suffer in the way, he says, that Germans have suffered on the bombardment of the Allies. So he says, and he says that they've been, in other words, many Jews have been killed. There are plenty of records of reports from SS units to Hitler, which were typed on a special typewriter used for Hitler because he was extremely short-sighted, so it had very large keys and large letters, sent to him with scribbled underneath the fact that he'd actually seen it, so he'd gone through it. So there's plenty of evidence that Hitler knew about this. Right. I think it's kind of futile to look for a single written order. That's not the way in which the Nazi regime really worked. There is, it's true, a written order for the killing of 200,000 or so mental patients, mentally ill and mentally sick, in Germany itself. There's an order for that by Hitler. But that, I think, is because there were lawyers, there were judges, prosecutors who would regard this as murder. There were doctors who might think of this as against the Hippocratic Oath. And so they needed to be shown this order in order not to start objecting to it. But the extermination of the Jews was carried out by the SS, by people fanatically loyal to Hitler. They did not need a written order to do it.
So as you say, there's plenty of evidence, and the trial that I mentioned was when you went to court to discredit this self-described historian David Irving.
Well, not really, no.
It was a court case in which you had to prove that his deniability of the Holocaust did not hold water. Still, you know, he has been discredited. You contribute to that. But then you have somebody like Ahmadinejad, you know, the president of Iran, still maintaining this line, the Holocaust never happened. Why does this myth persist when there's so much evidence?
Well, I think, you know, there are some people who will never be persuaded by any evidence, of course. I think in terms of the Middle East, it's certainly the case that some rather extreme anti-Israeli politicians feel that the Holocaust legitimizes Israel. The Holocaust gives Israel the justification for existing. And so if they can disprove the Holocaust, then they can take away Israel's right to exist. I think this is only a small number of extremists. There's a small number of extremist websites and Islamist websites. And more importantly, I think it's not actually very centrally important to the arguments that Islamists and others put against the State of Israel. Because what concerns the spokespeople for the Palestinians and for other groups in the Middle East is not really the past, it's the present. What really matters to them is what Israel does here and now.
So even politically, it's foolish.
Politically, I think it's very foolish. It's not necessary to, whatever the rights and wrongs of the issues, it's not necessary to discredit the Holocaust, to discredit Israel. If you want to discredit Israel, then try and do it with reference to present-day politics.
I may be asking you to stretch your imagination a bit, historical imagination, if I can call it. But do you see circumstances in the world today for the appearance of another Hitler? Not a tin pot dictator in a banana republic, but a major dictator in a major influential country with international influence?
Well, history doesn't repeat itself. So that's not going to happen. I think the impact of the memory of Nazism, the war, the Holocaust, on world consciousness is not just one reason why people continue to be so fascinated by these things, but also I think a major reason why it's not going to happen again. If you look at Germany, for example, even the slightest hint that somebody doesn't disapprove of any aspect of Nazism leads to a public storm and a debate. So I think there's a kind of allergic reaction that's going to stop that happening in the future. I think if democracy is undermined in any major country, it'll be by much more insidious ways.
Such as in the current days, do you see ominous signs of that, such as the curtail of rights, civil rights, the use of torture, the fight against international terrorism? Do you see that as a threat, as a danger in that respect?
Well, obviously,
the maintenance of democracy.
Yeah, obviously, democracy has a fundamental problem because it believes in extending equal rights as far as possible to everyone and freedom of speech and all the rest of it, but it thereby gives its enemies the weapons with which they can try and destroy it. Goebbels himself, the head of the propaganda arm of the party before the Nazis came to power, wrote about what he called the stupidity of democracy, giving us the weapons to destroy it. So there's always a dilemma which faces democracies, is how far do we go in as it were, repressing in modifying our freedoms to stop the process of terrorists undermining us. And I do feel that some democracies have gone too far in surrendering human rights in order to combat terrorism. It's a very fine line and a difficult decision, but I don't think, for example, that torture of terrorist suspects is something that a democracy should be condoning.
Okay, thanks very much. And then I go to this. Se você quiser mais detalhes sobre esta entrevista e outras do Milênio, acesse o blog do Milênio no site da Globo News.